The timestamp on the first audio file read 2:47 a.m., and the date was from 3 years ago. I heard my own voice, thick and slow, answering questions I had no memory of being asked. Sarah's voice was crisp and clinical on the recording, nothing like the warm murmur I remembered from our nights together. She was asking me about my childhood, and I was telling her things I had never told anyone, things I barely remembered myself. The cursor hovered over the next file. There were 317 more. I sat back from the laptop and looked at my hands. They were steady. The coffee beside me had gone cold an hour ago, maybe 2. The afternoon light coming through the kitchen window had that flat quality of late autumn, and I could hear the neighbor's dog barking in measured intervals. Everything felt normal, except for the fact that my wife of 19 years had apparently been recording me in my sleep, or something close to it, for reasons I could not begin to understand. The encryption key had been absurdly simple once I stopped thinking like her husband and started thinking like an engineer. Her maiden name, backwards, with the year we met. I had been trying to close her accounts for 2 months, working through the tedious process of digital death, and I stumbled onto the hidden partition by accident while backing up her files. The drive was labeled Research Archive, which should have been my first warning. I've always been a man who completes tasks in order. Sarah used to tease me about it, the way I would finish one thing entirely before starting another, the way I kept lists and checked them twice. It served me well in my work, building systems that had to be reliable, and it served me now. I made a new folder on my desktop, labeled it Documentation, and began the work of understanding what my wife had done. The house was too quiet. Sarah had died in July, a stroke that gave no warning and took her in minutes. I had been at work. The neighbor found her in the garden, still holding the pruning shears. For 2 months I had been moving through the mechanics of loss, grateful in some distant way for all the small tasks that kept me occupied. Close the credit cards, transfer the accounts, notify the services, cancel the subscriptions, each one a small wound that eventually would scar over. This was different. I opened my own calendar archives and pulled up the date from that first recording. It had been a Tuesday. I remembered nothing unusual about it. I checked my work logs. Standard day, home by 6. I opened my medical records next. I took a prescription sleep aid back then, had for years because of irregular hours and project deadlines. The doctor had told me it could cause some grogginess, maybe brief memory gaps, nothing serious. The second file was from a week later, same timestamp. My voice again, slower this time, and Sarah asking me to describe my relationship with my father. I listened for 5 minutes before I stopped it. I had told her things I would never have said in daylight. Private humiliations. Small cruelties I had absorbed as a child and packed away. She was prompting me, gently, the way you might coax a reluctant witness, and I was answering with the kind of honesty that only comes from people who think they are dreaming. I stood and walked through the house, our house. The mortgage was in both names, the furniture we had chosen together, the paint colors she had picked while I nodded agreement. I touched the doorframe to our bedroom and looked at the bed. It was made with the precision she had always insisted on, hospital corners and smooth surfaces. I did it now from habit, the way I still bought the bread she liked, even though I preferred a different kind. There was a small desk in the corner of the bedroom, the one she used for her work. Sarah had been a clinical psychologist, specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy. She worked from home 2 days a week, seeing clients over video calls. I had never thought to look closely at her professional files after she died. Patient confidentiality survived death, I assumed, and I had no reason to intrude. I opened the desk drawers. Files organized by date, notes in her small, neat handwriting, nothing that seemed unusual. The bottom drawer was locked. I had a set of small picks in my toolbox, the kind that come in handy when you work with hardware. It took me 3 minutes to open it. Inside were notebooks, 5 of them, bound in leather, labeled by year. I opened the most recent one. The first entry was dated 4 years ago, and it began with a hypothesis. She was testing whether sustained suggestion during sleep-assisted states could produce measurable behavioral changes in a subject who believed the interactions were spontaneous. The subject was identified only as participant A. The handwriting was hers, but the tone was nothing I recognized. It was detached, observational, the language of someone documenting an experiment. I read for an hour. She had been studying me, not just recording me, but actively conducting research. The sleep medication I took, she had suggested it to me in the first place, mentioned it casually after reading an article about sleep quality. I remembered that conversation. She had been concerned about my health, my stress levels. I had trusted her completely. According to her notes, she had been waking me during specific sleep cycles, asking carefully designed questions and recording my responses. Then, she would make suggestions, small behavioral adjustments presented as casual observations the next day. She was testing whether she could shape my decisions, my preferences, even my memories of events. And she was tracking the results with the precision of someone who intended to publish. The sun had set. I turned on the desk lamp and continued reading. She documented moments I thought were spontaneous. The time I suddenly decided to change jobs, she had planted that idea over 6 sessions. The argument we had about moving to a bigger house, she had engineered it by asking me leading questions while I was under, then acting surprised when I brought up the topic later. Even small things, my opinions about movies, preferences for restaurants, thoughts about our friends. She had been testing the limits of what she could manipulate, and I had been the perfect subject because I never suspected. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before she died. She wrote that the experiment had been successful beyond her initial hypothesis. She had demonstrated that sustained access to a subject during sleep-vulnerable states could produce significant and lasting changes in behavior, preference, and even memory. She noted that she intended to write up the results for publication, with identifying details changed, of course. And then she wrote something that made me close the notebook and sit in the dark for a while. She wrote that she had grown uncomfortable with the ethical implications, that she had started the project with purely scientific interest, but had begun to question whether the intimacy of marriage had blinded her to the violation she was committing. She wrote that she planned to stop the recordings and tell me everything. She wanted to see if the behavioral changes would persist without reinforcement and whether honesty could repair what deception had compromised. She died before she could tell me. I went back to the laptop and looked at the dates of the recordings. The last one was from 10 days before her death. I did not open it. Instead, I began organizing what I had found. I made copies of the notebooks, photographing each page with my phone. I exported all the audio files to an external drive and stored the original laptop in my fireproof safe. I sent encrypted copies to my cloud storage with access instructions in my will. If something happened to me, someone would find this. Then I called my doctor. The appointment took 3 days to arrange. I told him I needed to review my prescription history and discuss possible side effects. He was patient and thorough. Yes, the medication I had been taking could cause suggestibility during certain sleep stages. Yes, it was possible for someone to hold conversations with a person under its influence without the person retaining clear memories. No, it was not commonly known because it was not commonly a problem. Most people taking sleep medication were sleeping alone or with partners who were not trained psychologists conducting experiments. I asked him to run a full blood panel, checking for anything unusual. He asked if I was feeling well, and I told him I was being careful. The results came back clean. Whatever Sarah had done, she had stopped early enough that there was no permanent physical impact. I contacted a lawyer next. I explained the situation in simple terms. My deceased wife had been conducting undisclosed psychological research on me without my knowledge or consent. I had documentation. I wanted to know what my options were. She listened without interrupting, took notes, and told me she would need to research the specific laws around consent and posthumous liability. A week later, she called me back. The situation was unusual. Since Sarah was deceased, there could be no criminal charges. Civil action would be difficult because I would be suing her estate, which was also my estate. The recordings themselves were illegal under state wiretapping laws, but enforcement was complicated by the fact that they were made by a spouse in a shared residence. The most significant issue was the ethical violation from a professional standpoint. If Sarah had intended to publish this research, she would have been subject to review by her professional licensing board. That review could still happen. I asked what would happen if I reported it. The lawyer said it would likely result in a posthumous investigation, possible revocation of her licenses, and a formal finding of ethical misconduct. It would not undo what had happened, but it would create a record. I thanked her and said I would think about it. The next weeks were strange. I went to work, maintained my routines, and at night I listened to more of the recordings. I was trying to understand what parts of me were still my own choices and what parts had been guided by someone else's invisible hand. It was like discovering that the life you remembered was slightly out of focus, and no matter how hard you tried, you could not make it sharp again. I found that some of my preferences had already started to shift. The job I had been so certain about leaving, I no longer wanted to quit. The furniture she had convinced me to like, I now found uncomfortable. It was as if her death had broken whatever hold the suggestions had, slowly reverting to something more fundamental. But some things remained. I still made the bed her way. I still checked my lists twice. I still preferred the systematic approach to problems that she had reinforced during those sessions. I could not tell what was originally mine and what had been planted. Maybe it did not matter. Maybe we are all just collections of suggestions we have absorbed from people we trusted. I called her former supervisor at the clinic where she had worked. I told him I had found some concerning research materials among her belongings and thought he should be aware of them. He asked what kind of materials. I told him I would prefer to discuss it in person and share copies of the documentation. We met at a coffee shop. I brought printouts of selected pages from her notebooks and a USB drive with 3 sample audio files. He read through the pages slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern to something harder. When he finished, he looked at me and asked if I was all right. I told him I was managing. He asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint. I said I wanted to understand what the process would involve. First, he explained that the licensing board would need to investigate. They would review all the materials, possibly interview me, and make a determination about whether Sarah had violated professional ethics standards. Given the nature of the research, the lack of consent, and the personal relationship, he expected the finding would be severe. It would become part of the public record. Her professional reputation would be destroyed. I asked him what he thought I should do. He said that was not his decision to make, but that if he had been in my position, he would want answers. He said he would want to know why. He said he would want some kind of acknowledgement, even if it came too late to matter. I went home and opened the last audio file, the one from 10 days before she died. It was different from the others. There was no interview, no questions. It was just Sarah talking, her voice low and tired. She said she was sorry. She said the project had started as intellectual curiosity, a chance to test theories she had been developing for years. She said I had been convenient, available, trusting. She said she had told herself it was harmless, that she was not hurting me, that the changes she suggested were small and possibly even beneficial. Then she said she had been wrong, that watching me over the past months, seeing how I had changed in ways I did not understand, it made her realize the depth of the betrayal. She said she had been planning to tell me everything, to give me the recordings and her notes, to let me decide what to do with them. She said she hoped I could forgive her, but she would understand if I could not. She said she loved me, and that part at least had always been real. The recording ended. I sat with my laptop in the dark kitchen and thought about trust, about how easy it is to break and how impossible to repair, about the distance between intention and impact, about the way we think we know people and how wrong we can be. I made my decision in the morning. I contacted the licensing board and filed a formal complaint, including all documentation. I met with an investigator and answered questions for 3 hours. I provided copies of everything, the notebooks, the recordings, the prescription history. I signed statements and affidavits. I told them I wanted this on record so that no one else would go through what I had experienced. The investigation took 2 months. The board found that Sarah had engaged in serious ethical misconduct, had violated multiple professional standards, and had conducted research without proper oversight or consent. They revoked her licenses posthumously and issued a public reprimand. The finding was published in the board's quarterly report, and several of her former colleagues reached out to express their shock and support. None of it brought her back. None of it changed what had happened, but it gave me a kind of closure. The knowledge that someone official had looked at what she did and said it was wrong. That mattered more than I expected. I sold the house 4 months later. Too many recordings had been made in those rooms, too many invisible violations layered into the walls. I found a smaller place across town, bought new furniture, and started over. I kept her photo on my desk, not because I had forgiven her, but because pretending she had never existed felt like another kind of lie. I still think about those recordings sometimes, about the version of myself that spoke with such unguarded honesty in the middle of the night, about whether that person was more real than the one who moved through daylight with careful control, about whether trust is something you can choose to rebuild or whether it is simply gone once broken. What I know now is that betrayal does not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it is quiet and methodical, wrapped in care and justified with curiosity. Sometimes the person who hurts you believes they are helping. Sometimes they realize their mistake too late to matter. I learned to sleep without medication. It took months, but I got there. And when I lie awake now in the dark, listening to the silence, I know that whatever thoughts I have are mine alone. No one is recording. No one is asking questions I will not remember. The privacy of my own mind has been restored. That's enough.